In her quiet suburban home office, a 72-year-old widow was about to discover a betrayal that would shatter everything she thought she knew about family trust. What started as checking routine morning emails took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her own stolen identity. Margaret Whitmore wasn't your typical vulnerable senior citizen. For 40 years, she had spent her life as a meticulous librarian, known for her razor-sharp investigative instincts and uncompromising standards of integrity. When she encountered fraudulent emails offering to sell her precious antique collection, she had no idea she was walking into a web of desperation that reached into the heart of her own family. Margaret's methodical investigation that would lead to uncovering her son's gambling addiction and her daughter-in-law's desperate fraud. What began as suspicious correspondence would become a family crisis that tested the very meaning of love, legacy, and forgiveness. The Whitmore family would never be the same after Margaret discovered that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of the deepest betrayals and the most profound redemption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Whitmore adjusted her reading glasses and settled into the burgundy leather chair that Harold had bought her for their 40th anniversary. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of her home office, casting gentle shadows across the mahogany desk where her laptop sat among carefully organized papers. At 72, she maintained her daily routines with the precision of someone who understood that structure was the bulwark against chaos. The familiar chime of incoming email drew her attention back to the screen. She expected the usual correspondence: updates from the Antiquarian Society, newsletters from auction houses, perhaps a message from fellow collector Eleanor Patterson about the upcoming estate sale in Hartford. What she found instead made her breath catch. Your inquiry about the Eastlake parlor set, read the subject line of the first message. Margaret's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She had made no such inquiry. The sender was Robert Sterling from Sterling Antiques, a reputable dealer she'd worked with before. His message was businesslike, but warm. Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for your interest in selling your Victorian parlor set. Based on the photographs you provided, I can offer $200 for the complete set. The carved rosewood is exceptional, and the original horsehair upholstery adds considerable value. Please let me know your decision at your earliest convenience. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she scrolled to the next message. Then, the next. 5 emails, all responses to inquiries about selling pieces from her collection. Her collection. The mice and porcelain figurines Harold had given her for each wedding anniversary. The Georgian silver tea service they'd found together at an estate sale in Newport. The walnut armoire that had belonged to her grandmother. Each email contained intimate details about her antiques, details that could only come from someone who had seen them, studied them, understood their provenance and value. Margaret's librarian mind, honed by 40 years of research and cataloging, began to work methodically through the implications. She opened a new browser window and typed in her own name, followed by Gmail. Her heart sank as the familiar blue interface appeared, confirming her worst fear. Someone had created an email account using her name, Margaret Whitmore, antiquesagmail.com. The account she was reading from, her legitimate email, was Margaret Whitmore Charter. Net, the same address she'd used for 15 years. Margaret's reflection stared back at her from the darkened screen of her phone. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, her blue cardigan buttoned precisely, pearl earrings, Harold's gift, catching the morning light. She looked like exactly what she was, a respectable widow, a woman of dignity and order. The kind of person others should respect, not deceive. But someone had stolen her identity. Someone was masquerading as her online, offering to sell the treasures that represented 60 years of marriage, decades of careful collecting, a lifetime of shared memories with Harold. Margaret rose from her chair and walked to the bay window that overlooked her garden. The roses Harold had planted were blooming their second flush of the season, deep red against the white picket fence. 3 years since his heart attack, and she still caught herself thinking she heard his footsteps on the front porch, still set 2 teacups out of habit before remembering. The antiques weren't just objects to her. They were the tangible proof of their life together. The Queen Anne lowboy where Harold always left his keys. The Chinese export porcelain they'd discovered on their honeymoon trip to San Francisco. The mantel clock that had chimed the hours through David's childhood, through sleepless nights when Harold was deployed, through quiet evenings when age had finally slowed their adventures to gentle reminiscences. Margaret returned to her desk and began to examine the fraudulent emails more carefully. The imposter had been thorough. Each inquiry included detailed photographs of her pieces, accurate descriptions of their condition and provenance, even knowledge of the small chip on the spode tureen that she'd never mentioned to anyone outside the family. Her investigative instincts, dormant since retirement but never fully extinguished, began to stir. During her years at the county library, she'd helped countless patrons trace genealogies, verify historical facts, uncover documentation. She knew how to follow a trail of evidence. The email timestamps revealed that this had been going on for at least 3 weeks. The imposter had contacted 7 different dealers and auction houses. Whoever was doing this had access to her home, knew the layout of her rooms, understood which pieces were most valuable. They'd photographed everything, carefully, from angles that showed the maker's marks and identifying characteristics. Margaret's chest tightened as the realization dawned. This wasn't some random internet scammer or identity thief operating from a distance. This was someone who knew her personally, someone who had been in her home, someone she trusted. The list of possibilities was short and devastating. David, her only child, had keys to the house. So did Claire, her daughter-in-law. They were the only ones besides herself who knew about the hidden compartment in the secretary desk where she kept insurance appraisals and documentation. They were the only ones who'd heard the stories behind each piece, who understood the significance of the collection to her daily life. Margaret's fingers moved across the keyboard with growing determination. She created a new folder in her email program and began forwarding the messages, organizing them chronologically. Then she opened a word processing document and began taking notes, her librarian training asserting itself. Dates, times, dealers contacted, items discussed, evidence. As she worked, memories surfaced unbidden. David as a little boy, running, his fingers along the carved details of the dining room sideboard while she told him stories about the craftsman who'd made it. Claire, newly married and eager to learn about the family heirlooms, asking careful questions about proper care and preservation. Both of them at Harold's funeral, helping her inventory the collection for insurance purposes, their faces somber, with shared grief. One of them had betrayed that trust. One of them was stealing not just objects, but memories. Not just antiques, but the very foundation of her identity as the keeper of family history. Margaret saved her notes and closed the laptop with quiet deliberation. She would not be anyone's victim. She had survived Harold's death, had navigated the practical and emotional complexities of widowhood, had maintained her independence and dignity through 3 years of loneliness. She would not let someone, even someone she loved, reduce her to a helpless old woman to be deceived and robbed. But she would not rush to judgment either. Her years of research had taught her the value of thorough investigation before drawing conclusions. She would gather evidence, verify facts, understand the full scope of what was happening before deciding how to respond. The morning light had shifted, and somewhere in the house, the mantel clock chimed 10 o'clock. Margaret straightened her shoulders and reached for her phone. There were calls to make, plans to formulate. Someone close to her had decided she was too old, too trusting, too vulnerable to protect what was hers. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The mantel clock's chime still echoed through the house as Margaret opened her laptop again, her fingers moving with newfound purpose. She had survived 3 years of widowhood by refusing to surrender to helplessness, and she would not start now. First, she needed to understand the full scope of the deception. Margaret opened the fraudulent Gmail account's login page and stared at it for a long moment. During her library career, she'd helped patrons recover forgotten passwords, guided them through digital mysteries that seemed insurmountable. The skills that had made her invaluable to confused researchers would serve her well now. She tried Harold's birthday, then David's, then her own maiden name. Nothing. Then, on impulse, she entered the date of Harold's death, March 15, 2021. The screen flickered, and suddenly she was inside the imposter's email account. Margaret's breath caught. The betrayal was even more extensive than she'd imagined. The sent folder Conte. Research into market values, competitive pricing strategies, even seasonal timing considerations. Whoever was doing this understood both the antique market and her personal communication style, with an intimacy that made her skin crawl. But it was the photo gallery that truly devastated her. Image after image of her most precious possessions, photographed with professional care. The Waterford crystal collection arranged on her dining room table, natural light carefully positioned to showcase the cut patterns. The Georgian silver tea service on her sideboard, polished to gleaming perfection. Her grandmother's wedding, china, each piece individually documented with close-ups of maker's marks and decorative details. Margaret's hands shook as she scrolled through the photos. These weren't hasty snapshots taken during a family visit. These were carefully composed images, taken by someone who understood how to present antiques for sale. Someone who had spent considerable time in her house, moving freely through her rooms, handling her treasures with the casual familiarity of ownership. The timestamps revealed the violation's true scope. Photos taken on Tuesday afternoons when she attended her book club, Wednesday mornings during her weekly grocery shopping, Thursday evenings when she volunteered at the literacy center. Someone had been studying her schedule, mapping her routines, turning her predictable habits into opportunities for invasion. Margaret closed the laptop and walked through her house with new eyes. In the dining room, she noticed that the silver service wasn't quite aligned as she always kept it. The mice and figurines on the mantelpiece were arranged differently than she remembered. Small disturbances she'd attributed to her own forgetfulness now revealed themselves as evidence of intrusion. Her sanctuary had been violated repeatedly, systematically, by someone who knew her well enough to anticipate her movements and cover their tracks. The thought made her stomach turn. How often had she returned home, unsuspecting, to rooms that had been invaded in her absence? How many times had she touched objects that strangers' hands had recently handled? Margaret returned to her office and opened her personal calendar, cross-referencing her activities with the photo timestamps. The pattern was unmistakable. Every image had been taken during one of her regular absences from home. Someone had been watching her, learning her schedule, waiting for opportunities. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for TechGuard Security, the company that had installed her home alarm system after Harold's death. The technician, a young man named Marcus who'd been patient with her questions during the installation, answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Whitmore? Is everything all right with your system?" "Marcus, I need to ask you about adding cameras, hidden ones." Her voice was steady, determined. "Someone has been entering my home without permission, and I need proof." Within 2 hours, Marcus had arrived with a discreet camera system. "We'll place them strategically," he explained, his manner professional but concerned. "Motion activated. Wireless transmission to your phone and computer. If anyone enters while you're away, you'll know immediately." As Marcus worked, Margaret found herself studying his movements, noting how he handled her possessions, where he looked, what details he absorbed. The violation had made her suspicious of everyone, transformed her welcoming home into a fortress. of watchful paranoia. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus said gently as he finished the installation, "have you considered involving the police? Breaking and entering is a serious crime, especially when it involves elder." He caught himself, but Margaret's eyes flashed. "I am not a victim, young man. I'm conducting an investigation." Her tone carried the authority she'd once used to quiet, disruptive library patrons. "When I have evidence, I'll decide what steps to take." After Marcus left, Margaret returned to her methodical analysis. She created a spreadsheet. Harold had always marveled at her organizational skills, listing every person who had access to her home. David and Claire, obviously. Mrs. Patterson from next door, who had a key for emergencies. Her cleaning lady, Maria, who came monthly. The handful of service people who'd worked in the house over the past year. But as she examined the photos, more carefully, the circle of suspects narrowed. The images showed intimate knowledge of each piece's history and significance. The photographer knew which angles best displayed the craftsmanship, which details collectors would want to see. They knew about the tiny repair on the Chinese export bowl, the replacement handle on the silver creamer, the slight warping in the walnut table's veneer. This wasn't just someone with physical access to her home. This was someone who'd listened to her stories, absorbed the provenance of each piece, understood the collection's emotional and financial value. Someone who'd sat at her dining room table while she served tea in the spode china and told the story of how she and Harold had found it in a dusty antique shop in Portsmouth. Someone who'd admired the Waterford crystal while she explained how each piece had been a Christmas gift during their early years of marriage. Margaret's throat tightened as the implications crystallized. The betrayal went beyond theft or deception. Someone she loved, someone she trusted, had been planning this for weeks. They'd exploited her routines, violated her privacy, turned her generous sharing of family history into a catalog for sale. As afternoon shadows lengthened across her office floor, Margaret made herself a cup of tea in Harold's favorite mug and sat quietly among her remaining treasures. Tomorrow, she would test her new security system. She would discover which of the people she loved was capable of such calculating betrayal. But tonight, she needed to prepare herself for the possibility that her suspicions would be confirmed. That her safe, ordered world was about to fracture along lines she'd never imagined possible. The evidence was pointing toward family, toward David or Claire, toward people whose presence at her dinner table now felt like reconnaissance missions rather than loving visits. Margaret touched the small camera hidden among the books on her shelf. Soon, she would have her answers. And then she would have to decide what to do with the truth. Margaret touched the small camera hidden among the books on her shelf one last time before the doorbell rang. The evidence was pointing toward family, but she needed confirmation before her world fractured completely. Tonight's dinner would provide answers, one way or another. "Grandma Margaret!" 8-year-old Emily burst through the front door, her arms wrapping around Margaret's waist with the unconscious affection of childhood. Behind her, 5-year-old James toddled forward, his small hands already reaching for the candy dish Margaret kept on the hall table. "Easy, sweetheart," Claire said, following the children inside. "Let Grandma breathe." Margaret studied her daughter-in-law as she hung her coat in the closet. Claire's burgundy sweater had a small snag near the hem that had been carefully mended, the kind of repair that spoke of making do rather than replacing. Her jeans, once expensive, showed wear at the knees and had been hemmed to hide fraying. Even her handbag, a designer piece Margaret remembered admiring 2 years ago, now showed scuffed corners and a worn strap. "Where's Daddy?" Emily asked, settling onto the sofa beside Margaret. "He's coming," Claire replied, but her eyes flickered toward the window. He had to make a quick stop. Margaret's trained ear caught the tension beneath Claire's casual tone. During her library years, she'd developed an instinct for reading people, the nervous graduate student stretching the truth about overdue books, the researcher whose story about academic purposes didn't quite ring true. Claire was managing information, controlling the narrative. David arrived 20 minutes later, his apologies flowing with practiced ease. "Sorry, Mom. Got held up at work." But his eyes were too bright, his smile too wide, and Margaret noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he kissed her cheek. The scent that clung to him wasn't the familiar smell of his office. It carried something else. Something that reminded her of the casino Harold had taken her to once for her birthday, years ago. At dinner, Margaret served the pot roast on her grandmother's china, the same Haviland pattern she'd been photographed without her knowledge. She watched David's face as she set down the serving platter, looking for any flicker of recognition or guilt. Nothing registered in his expression, but his attention seemed elsewhere entirely. "Emily tells me you had parent conferences this week," Margaret said, settling into her chair. "How are the children doing?" "Wonderful," Claire replied quickly. "Emily's reading at a 5th grade level, and James is excelling in his pre-K program." "That's expensive, private pre-K," Margaret observed casually, "especially with Emily's piano lessons and soccer. It must stretch the budget." David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Claire's smile remained perfectly in place, but Margaret caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "We manage," Claire said. "David's been working extra projects." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of managing expenses, I had an interesting conversation with Robert Sterling yesterday. He appraised some pieces for me. I'm thinking about updating my insurance coverage." Both David and Claire looked up with sudden interest. "Really?" Claire asked. "Which pieces?" "I mean, that's smart to stay current with values." Margaret smiled, testing the waters. "The Meissen figurines, mainly. Robert says they've appreciated significantly. He estimated the pair at nearly $8,000 now. The truth was that Sterling had quoted $3,000, but Margaret wanted to see how her family would react to inflated numbers. Claire's eyes widened slightly. $8,000? For those little shepherdess figures? David shifted in his chair. "Mom, you should be careful about sharing those kinds of details. Insurance fraud is a real problem with antiques." Margaret found his concern ironic, given her discoveries. "Oh, I'm very careful about protecting my collection," she said meaningfully. "I've become quite security conscious lately." Throughout the meal, Margaret continued her subtle interrogation. She mentioned the Georgian Silver's recent appraisal, again inflating the numbers. She discussed the market for Victorian furniture, noting how specific pieces were in high demand. Each time she shared financial information, Claire's attention sharpened with laser focus, while David grew increasingly fidgety. His phone buzzed constantly during dinner. Each time, he would glance at the screen with an expression that cycled through hope, anxiety, and disappointment. When Margaret asked about it, he claimed it was work, but the messages seemed to arrive in patterns that had nothing to do with business hours. "David, dear, perhaps you could put that away," Margaret suggested after his 4th glance in 5 minutes. "Family time should be sacred." "Sorry, Mom." But even as he placed the phone face down on the table, his eyes kept drifting toward it. When it buzzed again, his whole body tensed. Claire reached across and squeezed his hand. "It's fine," she murmured, but Margaret caught the undercurrent of something else, not reassurance but warning. After dinner, while Margaret and Claire cleared the dishes, David disappeared to the bathroom with his phone. Claire worked quietly beside her, but Margaret noticed how her movements had changed. Gone was the relaxed ease of previous visits. Instead, Claire handled each piece of china with the careful attention of someone cataloging its weight and value. "This pattern is so beautiful," Claire said, running her finger along the rim of a dinner plate. "Haviland, isn't it? From the 1890s? Margaret's blood chilled. She'd never specifically mentioned the pattern name or date to Claire. That information had come from years of careful research, details she'd shared only in passing conversations about family history. For Claire to remember those specifics suggested a level of attention that went beyond casual interest. "You have such a good memory," Margaret said carefully. "I find your collection fascinating." Claire replied. Each piece has such a story. From the hallway came the low murmur of David's voice, urgent and strained. Margaret couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. When he returned to the kitchen, his face was pale and drawn. "Everything all right?" Margaret asked. "Fine," he said quickly. "Just work stuff. You know how it is." But Margaret knew how David handled work stress, and this wasn't it. This was the look he'd worn as a teenager when he'd been caught in lies, the same wide-eyed, over-innocent expression that had never fooled her then and didn't fool her now. As the evening wound down, Margaret noticed other telling details. Claire's careful inventory of the dining room as she helped serve dessert. David's distracted responses to the children's chatter. The hushed conversation between husband and wife that stopped abruptly when Margaret approached. When they gathered in the living room, Emily settled beside Margaret on the sofa. "Grandma, will you tell us about the music box again?" Margaret reached for the Victorian music box on the side table, one of the pieces that had been photographed for the fraudulent sales inquiry. As she wound the delicate mechanism and the tinkling melody began, she watched David and Claire's faces carefully. "Your grandfather won this for me at a county fair," Margaret began, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of a story told many times. "It was 1963, and he was determined to prove he could knock down those milk bottles." Emily and James listened with rapt attention, but Margaret's focus was on the adults. Claire's expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes kept drifting to the music box itself, assessing, calculating. David sat rigidly, his phone face down on his lap, but his leg bouncing with nervous energy. As Margaret finished the story, her phone chimed with a security alert. Someone had triggered the motion sensor in her dining room, but everyone was accounted for in the living room. She glanced at the notification discreetly. The timestamp showed the alert had been triggered 3 days ago, during her book club meeting. The system was working perfectly, recording every unauthorized entry. "I should get the children home," Claire said suddenly, rising from her chair. "School tomorrow." The departure felt rushed, almost frantic. Hugs were brief, promises to call soon felt hollow, and Margaret noticed that neither David nor Claire met her eyes directly as they said goodbye. Standing in her doorway, watching their car disappear into the darkness, Margaret felt the weight of certainty settling over her. The evening had confirmed what her investigation already suggested. David and Claire were hiding something significant, financial trouble by all appearances. Their behavior around her antiques had shifted from casual appreciation to careful evaluation. And David's phone behavior suggested problems that went beyond normal work stress. Margaret closed and locked the front door, checking the deadbolt. Twice. Tomorrow, she would review the security footage from the past week. She would trace more of the fraudulent emails, document every piece of evidence. But tonight, she had to face the painful truth that was crystallizing with devastating clarity. Someone in her family was betraying her trust, and she was running out of ways to deny it. Margaret closed and locked the front door, the weight of certainty pressing against her chest like a stone. But certainty and proof were different things, and 40 years of research had taught her the difference. She needed irrefutable evidence before she could act. The security footage would provide that evidence, one way or another. 3 days later, her phone buzzed with a motion alert while she sat in the literacy center, helping Mrs. Rodriguez practice, reading job applications. Margaret excused herself quietly and checked the notification. Someone was in her dining room. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m., exactly when she was scheduled to be at the center until 4. Margaret's hands remained steady as she closed the reading workbook. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm afraid we'll need to cut today's session short. A family emergency." The drive home took 12 minutes that felt like hours. Margaret parked 2 blocks away and walked to her house, her mind cycling through possibilities. Perhaps David had stopped by to borrow something. Perhaps Claire needed to use the bathroom while running errands with the children. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation for the intrusion. But when she quietly unlocked her front door and stepped inside, she could hear the distinctive click of her phone's camera from the dining room. Someone was photographing her collection. Again. Margaret moved silently through her own house, her heart hammering against her ribs. At the dining room doorway, she stopped. Claire stood at the mahogany sideboard, her phone positioned to capture the Georgian silver tea service from multiple angles. She worked with methodical efficiency, adjusting lighting, checking image quality, completely absorbed in her task. Getting good shots? Margaret's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Claire spun around, her phone clattering to the floor. Her face cycled through shock, guilt, and something desperate that Margaret had never seen before. "Margaret, I didn't hear you come in." Claire's voice pitched higher, the words tumbling over each other. "I was just—" David asked me to check on something. The insurance forms, from last time. Stop. Margaret's voice carried the authority she'd once used to silence entire reading rooms. "I know what you've been doing, Claire. I've known for days." Claire's face went pale. "I don't know what you mean." Margaret walked to her laptop, opened it, and turned the screen toward Claire. The fraudulent Gmail account filled the display. Dozens of emails visible in the inbox. "I mean this. I mean the fake email account. I mean the systematic photographing of my collection while I'm away from home. That's not— I didn't." Claire's denials died as Margaret clicked on the video from today's security alert. There, in perfect digital clarity, was Claire, entering through the front door with her own key, moving directly to the dining room, beginning her careful documentation of the silver service. "Sit down," Margaret said quietly. Claire remained standing, her hands twisting together. "Margaret, please, let me explain." "Sit down." The authority in Margaret's voice broke through Claire's panic. She collapsed into one of the dining room chairs, her face buried in her hands. Margaret remained standing, looking down at the woman she'd welcomed into her family 12 years ago. "How long has this been going on?" "I never sold anything," Claire said through her fingers. "I swear to you, I never actually sold anything. I was trying to understand what things were worth." "For 3 weeks? With detailed inquiries to 7 different dealers?" Margaret's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Claire, I have documented evidence of everything. The only question is whether you're going to tell me the truth or force me to piece it together myself." Claire's hands fell away from her face, revealing tears that Margaret might have found moving under different circumstances. "We're going to lose the house." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, but the first crack in her anger. "What?" "We're 3 months behind on the mortgage. The bank sent the foreclosure notice last week." Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. "David doesn't know I saw it. He hides the mail now. Thinks he's protecting me from worrying. But I know." Margaret sank into the chair across from Claire. 3 months behind? How is that possible? David has a good job. You've been careful with money. Claire's laugh was bitter, broken. "David has an addiction, Margaret. He's been gambling for 2 years. Online poker, sports betting, trips to the casino. He's gambled away the children's college funds, borrowed against the house, maxed out credit cards I didn't even know existed." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Her son, her careful, intelligent son, reduced to this. "He told you this?" "He told me some of it. I discovered the rest." Claire wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Do you know what it's like to find out your husband has been lying to you about everything? To realize that every work dinner might have been a poker game, every extra project might have been time at the casino?" Margaret thought of Harold, his gentle honesty, his transparent love. She tried to imagine living with systematic deception and felt her heart twist. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you ask for help?" "Because I was terrified you'd cut us off." Claire's voice cracked. You have such high standards, Margaret. You've never approved of weakness, never tolerated failure. I was afraid if you knew about David's addiction, you'd decide we weren't worth saving." The accusation stung because it contained truth. Margaret had always prized strength, independence, dignity. She'd raised David to be self-sufficient, had perhaps been too quick to judge those who stumbled. "So, you decided to steal from me instead." "I decided to try to save my children." Claire's voice turned fierce. "Emily and James don't know any of this. They don't know their father is destroying our family or that we might be homeless by Christmas. I was trying to find a way to catch up on the mortgage without having to explain to an 8-year-old why Daddy can't stop gambling." Margaret stared at her daughter-in-law, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the composed woman who'd married her son, not the perfect mother who managed holidays and school events with seamless efficiency. This was a woman pushed beyond her limits, making desperate choices to protect what mattered most. "You were going to sell my antiques to pay David's debts." "I was going to ask you to sell some pieces," Claire corrected. "I thought if I could show you exactly what they were worth, if I could present you with a complete plan for paying off the mortgage, you might be willing to help. But I needed to understand the values first, needed to have all the information before I approached you. By committing fraud, by violating my privacy, by entering my home without permission and photographing my possessions like you were casing the place for robbery." Claire flinched. "I know how it looks. I know what I did was wrong. But Margaret, I didn't know what else to do. David won't get help, won't admit he has a problem. The children are going to lose their home, their stability, everything. I was trying to save them the only way I could think of." Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at Harold's roses. 3 years of widowhood had taught her about desperate choices, about the things people did when they felt trapped and alone. She understood desperation better than she'd ever wanted to. But understanding wasn't forgiveness, and forgiveness wasn't the same as trust. "Where is David now?" she asked without turning around. "Work. He doesn't know I found the foreclosure notice. He doesn't know I know about most of his debts. He's still trying to handle it himself, still thinks he can gamble his way out of the hole he's dug." Margaret turned back to face Claire. "And what happens now? What happens when he can't hide it anymore?" "I don't know." Claire's voice was small, defeated. "I honestly don't know." Margaret looked at this woman who'd been part of her family for over a decade, who'd given her grandchildren she adored, who'd made the terrible choice to betray trust rather than risk abandonment. The situation was more complex than simple victim and villain. It was family destroying itself through addiction and fear and pride. "The dealers I contacted," Margaret said quietly. "Some of them have already committed to purchases based on your inquiries." Claire's face went white. "What does that mean?" "It means this is no longer just between us. It means there may be legal consequences you haven't considered." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "It means we need to figure out how to fix this before it destroys more than just our family." Margaret looked at this woman who'd been part of her family for over a decade, who'd made the terrible choice to betray trust rather than risk abandonment. The complexity of the situation weighed on her like a physical burden. "Call David," Margaret said quietly. "Tell him to come here. Now." Claire's eyes widened. "Margaret, please, let me talk to him first. Let me prepare him. No more preparation. No more managing information. No more lies." Margaret's voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "If we're going to fix this, it starts with the truth. All of it." Claire's hands shook as she dialed. Margaret listened to the one-sided conversation, hearing Claire's careful words. "David, you need to come to your mother's house. Right now. It's important." "No, the children are fine. Please, just come." 20 minutes later, David's key turned in the front door. Margaret heard his familiar footsteps, the same rhythm she'd listened for throughout his childhood, now carrying him toward a reckoning years in the making. "Mom? Claire?" His voice carried forced cheerfulness. "What's the emergency? I left work in the middle of a meeting." Margaret and Claire sat in the living room, surrounded by the antiques that had become unwitting witnesses to betrayal. David appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, his smile already fading as he read the tension in the room. "Sit down, David." Margaret's tone brooked no argument. He remained standing, his eyes darting between his mother and wife. "What's going on?" "I said sit down." David sank into Harold's old chair, the leather recliner where his father had read bedtime stories, helped with homework, dispensed gentle wisdom. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. Her son, who'd inherited Harold's charm but not his strength, sat in the seat of the man who'd never gambled away a single dollar of their family's security. Margaret opened her laptop and turned the screen toward David. The fraudulent Gmail account filled the display, dozens of emails visible. David's face went white. "I know about the fake email account," Margaret said calmly. "I know about Claire photographing my collection. I know about the inquiries to antique dealers. What I don't know is how my son became the kind of man who would let his wife commit fraud, rather than face his own problems." David's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Claire reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "David," Claire said, softly, "she knows about the gambling. She knows about the foreclosure notice." The words hit David like physical blows. He doubled over in the chair, his face buried in his hands. Oh, God, Mom, I'm so sorry." Margaret had expected anger or defiance. The broken shame in her son's voice was somehow worse. "Tell me how this happened, from the beginning." David's words came in fragments, punctuated by silence and self-recrimination. It had started 2 years ago with casual online poker during lunch breaks. A way to decompress from work stress, he claimed. $20 games that felt harmless, manageable. "But I was good at it," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "Or I thought I was. I'd win $200, $300 some weeks. It felt like I was finally good at something that mattered. Something that could actually help our family." Margaret's heart twisted. David had always been Harold's gentle son, more inclined toward books than sports, sensitive in ways that had made him an easy target for childhood bullies. She'd spent years building his confidence, teaching him that his worth wasn't measured by traditional masculine standards. Apparently, the lessons hadn't taken root as deeply as she'd hoped. "When did it stop being $20 games?" Margaret asked. David lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed. "About 6 months in. I'd had a bad week, lost everything I'd won the previous month. I told myself I just needed one good night to get back to even. The progression was predictable, tragic. $50 games became $100 games. Online poker expanded to sports betting. Lunch break gambling stretched into evening sessions he hid from Claire. Wins were reinvested. Losses were chased with bigger bets. The children's college. Funds, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. David's shoulders shook. I borrowed against them. I was sure I could pay it back before Claire found out. I had a system, a strategy. It was supposed to work. Gambling systems don't work, David. If they did, casinos would be bankrupt. I know that now. His voice cracked. I knew it then too, deep down. But I couldn't stop. Every loss meant I was closer to the big win that would fix everything. Every win meant I was smart enough to make it work if I just played a little longer. Claire sat rigidly beside him, her face a mask of controlled devastation. Margaret realized this might be the first time her daughter-in-law was hearing the full scope of David's dissent. "How much?" Margaret asked. David was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he whispered, 87,000. Dartsier, the number hung in the air like smoke. Claire made a small, wounded sound. Margaret felt the walls of her ordered world shifting. 87,000. Margaret repeated the figure, trying to comprehend how her responsible son had destroyed his family's financial future. And rather than come to me for help, you let Claire commit fraud. I didn't know what she was doing. David's words came out in a rush. I swear to you, Mom, I had no idea Claire was contacting dealers or taking pictures. I thought I could still fix it myself. How? Margaret's voice was sharp. How did you think you were going to find $87,000? David's silence was answer enough. He'd planned to gamble his way out of debt, to risk even more of his family's future on the same addiction that had created the crisis. So Claire took matters into her own hands, Margaret continued. Rather than let your children lose their home, she decided to sacrifice my trust and my possessions to cover for your weakness. Don't blame Claire. David's voice found strength defending his wife. This is my fault. All of it. She's been trying to hold our family together while I've been destroying it piece by piece. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. The boy who'd been afraid of disappointing her, who'd hidden report cards with B- grades because he thought she expected perfection. The young man who'd brought Claire home for the first time, nervous about whether his mother would approve. The father who'd sat in this same room 3 years ago, crying at Harold's funeral because he'd lost the one person who'd never judged him. Why didn't you come to me? Margaret asked quietly. Why let it get this far? David met her eyes for the first time since sitting down. Because I knew exactly what you'd say, what you'd think, that I was weak, that I was a disappointment, that Dad would have handled things differently. The words cut deep because they held truth. Margaret had always measured strength by Harold's standard, quiet competence, steady reliability, unshakable integrity. She'd raised David to admire those qualities without considering that he might not possess them naturally. Your father had his own struggles, Margaret said slowly. He just didn't let them destroy his family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dad never had struggles like this. Dad was perfect. Your father was human. Margaret's voice softened. He had moments of doubt, of weakness. The difference was that he faced them instead of running from them, and he never let pride prevent him from asking for help when he needed it. David's face crumpled. I've ruined everything. My marriage, my children's future, your trust. I don't know how to fix any of it. Margaret looked at her broken son, at Claire sitting beside him with fierce protective love despite everything, at the antiques surrounding them, objects that had survived decades of careful stewardship, only to become pawns in a family crisis. The question now wasn't what David had done, but what she was going to do about it. The choice would define not just her relationship with her son, but the kind of person she chose to be in the face of devastating disappointment. The first step, Margaret said quietly, is admitting that you can't fix this alone. Any of it. The gambling, the debt, the lies, all of it requires help you're not capable of providing yourself. David nodded, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in 2 years, Margaret saw a glimmer of the honest man she'd raised, buried beneath the shame and addiction, but still there. The reckoning had begun. Now came the harder part, deciding what came next. The reckoning had begun, but Margaret's phone rang before she could process what came next. The caller ID showed Sterling Antiques. Robert Sterling, the dealer whose email had first alerted her to the deception. "I should take this," Margaret said, stepping into the hallway. David and Claire remained in the living room, their whispered conversation a backdrop of urgent, hushed tones. "Mrs. Whitmore, Robert Sterling here. I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but I've been having some concerns about our recent correspondence." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What kind of concerns, Mr. Sterling?" "Well, the emails I've been receiving from your Gmail account. They don't quite match your usual communication style. More formal than our previous exchanges, and some of the details about your pieces seem off. I wanted to verify that you're actually interested in selling the Eastlake Parlor set." Margaret closed her eyes. The outside world was already pulling at the edges of their family crisis. "Mr. Sterling, I need to be honest with you. I didn't send those emails. Someone has been using my name without permission." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Sterling spoke, his voice careful and professional. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you saying someone has been impersonating you? Because if that's the case, I'm obligated to report this. Identity theft involving elder fraud is a serious federal crime." "Please," Margaret said quickly, "let me handle this internally first. It's a family matter and—" "Ma'am, I understand your desire for privacy, but I've already forwarded some of these communications to other dealers as references. This may have spread beyond what you can handle internally." Sterling's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm concerned that you may be the victim of a sophisticated scam, and I have a responsibility to report it." Margaret heard David's voice from the living room, his words broken and pleading. "I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could fix it before anyone got hurt." "Mr. Sterling," Margaret said, "give me 24 hours, please. Let me try to resolve this before involving authorities." "Mrs. Whitmore, I respect you tremendously, but I've already spoken with 2 other dealers who received similar inquiries. We're all comparing notes, and frankly, we're worried about you. If someone is targeting you specifically, you need professional help to stop them." The call ended with Sterling's promise to hold off on official reports until the next evening, but Margaret knew the window was closing. Other dealers were comparing notes, becoming suspicious, preparing to involve law enforcement whether she wanted it or not. She returned to the living room where David sat slumped in Harold's chair, looking older than his 38 years. Claire perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands twisted together in her lap. "Who was that?" Claire asked. "Robert Sterling. He's suspicious about the emails, and he's not the only one. Other dealers are comparing notes." Margaret settled into her chair, feeling the weight of inevitability. This is spiraling beyond our control. David looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means your wife's attempts to help you may have created legal problems that can't be solved with family meetings and good intentions." Before anyone could respond, the doorbell rang. Margaret glanced at the clock. 6:30 p.m. Not a time for casual visitors. Through the front window, she could see an unfamiliar sedan parked at the curb. Margaret opened the door to find a woman in her early 40s, professionally dressed, holding a badge and identification. Asian American, with kind but serious eyes. That took in Margaret's appearance with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating potential victims. "Mrs. Whitmore? I'm Detective Sarah Chen with the State Police Financial Crimes Unit. I'd like to speak with you about some reports we've received regarding potential elder fraud and identity theft." Margaret's heart sank. The outside world had arrived at her doorstep, uninvited and unavoidable. "Detective Chen, this really isn't a good time. Ma'am, I understand this may be uncomfortable, but we've received reports from multiple sources about someone impersonating you online to solicit antique sales. This kind of targeted fraud against elderly individuals is something we take very seriously." From the living room came the sound of hushed, urgent conversation. Detective Chen's eyes flickered past Margaret toward the voices. Are you alone, Mrs. Whitmore? If you're in any immediate danger, or if someone is preventing you from speaking freely, just nod and I'll call for backup. No, no danger, Margaret said quickly. My son and daughter-in-law are here. We were just having a family discussion. Detective Chen nodded but didn't relax her vigilant posture. Would it be possible for me to come in? I have some questions about the fraudulent emails, and I'd like to show you some evidence we've collected. Margaret had no choice but to step aside. Detective Chen entered with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to navigating delicate family situations. Her eyes quickly cataloged the room, the valuable antiques, the comfortable but not ostentatious furnishings, the family photos that spoke of long-term stability. In the living room, David and Claire had fallen silent. David's face was pale, his hands gripping the arms of Harold's chair. Claire sat frozen, her eyes wide with the look of someone who'd just realized the full scope of consequences she hadn't considered. I'm Detective Chen, she said, her voice professional but not unkind. I'm here to investigate reports of identity theft and elder fraud. I understand this is your son and daughter-in-law? Margaret made the introductions with the surreal politeness of a hostess at a dinner party. Detective Chen settled into a chair that gave her clear sight lines to all three family members, a positioning that Margaret recognized as tactical. Mrs. Whitmore, we've been contacted by several antique dealers who received suspicious emails from someone claiming to be you. The emails contain detailed photographs of antique collections and inquiries about selling valuable pieces. Are you currently planning to sell any of your antiques? Margaret felt the weight of 3 lives balancing on her next words. David's career, Claire's freedom, the children's stability, all hanging on whether she chose truth or family loyalty. The situation is complicated, Margaret said carefully. Detective Chen's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught the subtle shift in her posture. Complicated how? The silence stretched until Claire spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I sent those emails. Detective Chen turned her attention to Claire with laser focus. You sent emails impersonating Mrs. Whitmore? Yes. The word came out cracked, broken. I created the fake account. I took the photographs. I contacted the dealers. Claire, David started, but Detective Chen held up a hand. Ma'am, I need to inform you that identity theft, elder fraud, and wire fraud are serious federal crimes. Before you say anything else, you should understand that anything you tell me may be used as evidence. Her voice remained professional, but Margaret detected a note of sympathy. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Claire nodded, tears beginning to flow. I understand, and I did it. All of it. Detective Chen removed a small recording device from her jacket. I'm going to record this conversation for accuracy. Mrs. Whitmore, do you consent to this recording? In your home? Margaret looked at her family, her son destroyed by shame and addiction, her daughter-in-law facing potential criminal charges for trying to save them, her grandchildren unaware that their world was crumbling. She thought of Harold, of what he would do, what he would say. He'd always believed in facing consequences with dignity. I consent, Margaret said. For the next hour, the truth emerged in painful detail. Claire's confession was thorough, self-incriminating, and heartbreaking. She explained the financial crisis, David's gambling addiction, her desperate attempts to find a solution that wouldn't destroy their family. David corroborated every word, adding his own admissions about the extent of his gambling losses. Detective Chen listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, documenting a family's destruction with professional thoroughness. Mrs. Whitmore, Detective Chen said finally, as the victim of this fraud, you have the right to press charges. However, I should inform you that some of the dealers Mrs. Claire contacted have already initiated transactions based on the fraudulent emails. Mr. Jameson from Berkshire Estate Sales has transferred a deposit of $1,500 for what he believed was a confirmed sale. Margaret's heart sank further. Someone has already paid money? Yes, ma'am, which means this has moved beyond simple identity theft. There are now financial damages, documented losses, and a paper trail that multiple agencies are already investigating. Claire made a small, broken sound. David leaned forward, his face in his hands. What does that mean for my family? Margaret asked. Detective Chen's expression softened slightly. It means that regardless of your decision about pressing charges, the state may proceed with prosecution. When money changes hands based on fraudulent representations, it becomes a matter of public interest, not just personal choice. The room fell silent except for the quiet ticking of Margaret's mantel clock, the same clock that had marked the hours of David's childhood, that had chimed through family celebrations and quiet sorrows, that now measured the moments before. Everything changed forever. However, Detective Chen continued, your cooperation as the victim would be crucial to any prosecution. If you were to advocate for leniency, if the family were to make restitution for damages and seek appropriate treatment for the underlying issues, prosecutors might be willing to consider alternative resolutions. Margaret looked at her son, broken but not evil, at Claire, who'd made terrible choices from desperate love, at the antiques surrounding them, objects that had survived decades of care only to become evidence in a criminal investigation. What kind of alternative resolutions? Margaret asked. Counseling for the gambling addiction, restitution for financial damages, community service, probation rather than incarceration. The goal would be rehabilitation and restoration rather than pure punishment. Claire looked up through her tears. Margaret, I'm so sorry. I know I've destroyed your trust, violated your privacy, put you in an impossible position. Whatever happens to me, I deserve it. Margaret studied the woman who'd been part of her family for 12 years, who'd given her beloved grandchildren, who'd made the worst possible choices for understandable reasons. Detective Chen, Margaret said slowly, what happens if I don't? Cooperate with prosecution? The case becomes much harder to prove but not impossible. The electronic evidence exists. The financial transactions are documented. Your cooperation would strengthen the case significantly, but its absence wouldn't necessarily end it. Margaret realized that her choice wasn't really whether to save or condemn her family. Her choice was whether to have a voice in what happened next, or to let the legal system proceed without her input. I need time to think, Margaret said. To consult with an attorney, to understand all the implications. Detective Chen nodded and stood. I understand. But Mrs. Whitmore, I should warn you that this investigation is moving forward regardless. Other agencies are involved now. The longer this takes to resolve, the more complicated it's likely to become. As she handed Margaret her business card, Detective Chen's voice took on a more personal tone. For what it's worth, I've worked a lot of elder fraud cases. Usually, the perpetrators are strangers exploiting vulnerable seniors for quick profit. This is different. Tragic, but different. That matters in terms of how prosecutors approach these situations. After Detective Chen left, the three of them sat in stunned silence. The legal system had invaded their private crisis, transforming a family tragedy into a public matter with federal implications. Mom, David said finally, his voice hollow, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen to you. Margaret looked at her son, her daughter-in-law, her beautiful home now transformed into a crime scene. The choices ahead would define not just their family's future, but the kind of person she chose to be when everything she'd built was falling apart. Outside, Detective Chen's sedan pulled away, but Margaret knew she would be back. The outside world had found them, and there would be no private resolution to this crisis. The only question now was whether she would help shape the consequences or let them unfold without her guidance. The weight of that choice settled over her like a shroud, heavy with love and disappointment, and the terrible responsibility of deciding what justice looked like when it involved the people you loved most. The weight of that choice settled over Margaret like a shroud, but before she could fully process the legal implications of Detective Chen's visit, the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she saw Claire's neighbor dropping off Emily and James, their small figures racing toward the front door with the uncomplicated energy of childhood. "Oh, God," Claire whispered, her face pale. "I forgot. Mrs. Henderson was watching them during my book club meeting." She looked at Margaret with panic in her eyes. "What do we tell them?" Margaret felt a familiar protective instinct surge through her. These children, her grandchildren, had been living in the shadow of their parents' crisis without understanding. And Emily's bright curiosity and James's innocent affection had been constants in Margaret's world, unmarked by the deception and betrayal that had consumed the adults around them. "We tell them what they need to know," Margaret said, moving toward the door. "But first, let's find out how much they already understand." Emily burst through the front door with her characteristic enthusiasm, but stopped short when she saw the three adults sitting in the living room like participants in a funeral. James toddled behind her, his 5-year-old attention immediately drawn to the cookie jar on the side table. "Why does everyone look sad?" Emily asked with the directness that only children possessed. Her 8-year-old eyes moved from face to face, cataloging expressions with the same careful attention Margaret recognized in herself. "We were just having a grown-up conversation, sweetheart," Claire said, her voice carefully controlled. "How was your time with Mrs. Henderson?" Emily crossed her arms, a gesture that reminded Margaret so strongly of David at that age that her heart ached. "You always say grown-up conversation when you don't want to tell us something, but I already know you and Daddy are fighting about money." Claire's composure cracked slightly. "Emily, I heard you crying in the bathroom last week," Emily continued with relentless honesty. "And Daddy keeps getting phone calls that make him angry. And we haven't been to the grocery store in forever because you keep saying we need to watch our spending." Margaret watched her granddaughter with growing amazement. Emily had inherited more than just the family's observational skills. She had the courage to speak uncomfortable truths that the adults had been dancing around for months. James had successfully retrieved a cookie and was eating it with messy contentment, oblivious to the tension in the room. But Emily remained standing in the doorway, her young face serious beyond her years. "Are we poor now?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret saw Claire struggling with how to respond, saw David's shoulders shaking as he tried to hold himself together. The truth was too complex and too painful for a child to fully understand, but Emily's direct question demanded an honest answer. Margaret stood and walked to her granddaughter. "Emily, come sit with me. You too, James." She settled onto the sofa with both children flanking her, their warm weight familiar and comforting. Emily's serious eyes remained fixed on Margaret's face, while James contentedly shared his cookie crumbs with everyone within reach. "Sometimes," Margaret began carefully, "families go through difficult times when adults have to make hard decisions and figure out how to solve problems." "What kind of problems?" Emily asked. Margaret glanced at Claire and David, both of whom looked like they wanted to disappear. But running from difficult conversations had been part of what brought them to this crisis. Perhaps it was time for a different approach. "Your daddy has been having trouble with something called gambling," Margaret said, choosing her words carefully. "Do you know what that means?" Emily nodded gravely. "Like when people bet money on games and sometimes they lose all their money?" Margaret's eyebrows rose. "How do you know about that?" "There was the assembly at school about making good choices. They talked about gambling and drugs and other things that can hurt families." Emily's matter-of-fact tone made the adults exchange glances. "Is that why Daddy's been sad all the time?" David made a small, broken sound. He leaned forward in Harold's chair, his voice thick with emotion. "Emily, sweetheart, yes. Daddy made some very bad choices, and now our family has some problems because of it. Are we going to lose our house? Emily's question was delivered with the same calm directness she might have used to ask about dinner plans. Claire's sharp intake of breath was audible. Emily, why would you ask that? Because I heard you talking to Daddy about the bank calling, and Sarah Miller at school had to move to an apartment because her family lost their house. Emily's young face was composed, but Margaret could see the worry beneath her calm exterior. I figured if we're having money problems, maybe the same thing would happen to us. Margaret felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This child, this bright, perceptive, brave child, had been carrying these fears alone, trying to make sense of adult problems with the limited understanding of an 8-year-old. The adults had been so focused on protecting the children from the truth that they'd failed to notice the children were already living with the consequences of their silence. Emily, Margaret said gently, you're right that our family is facing some challenges. But what I want you to understand is that adults sometimes make mistakes, even big ones. And when that happens, other adults work together to figure out how to fix things. James, who had been quietly listening while playing with Margaret's bracelet, looked up suddenly. Is Daddy in trouble? The innocent question from her youngest grandchild nearly broke Margaret's composure. David was crying openly now, his hands covering his face. Daddy made some mistakes, Margaret said carefully. And yes, he's in trouble. But sometimes when people are in trouble, it's because they need help, not because they're bad people. Emily studied her father with the intense focus she usually reserved for her favorite books. Daddy, are you sick? David looked up confused. What do you mean, sweetheart? Well, at the assembly, they said addiction is like being sick. That people don't choose to be addicted, they just are. And they need help to get better. Emily's 8-year-old logic was both heartbreaking and remarkably sophisticated. So, if you have gambling addiction, does that mean you're sick and you need help to get better? Margaret watched her son's face transform as his daughter's simple question cut through months of shame and self-recrimination. Emily had distilled the complex web of addiction, responsibility, and recovery into terms that were both accurate and compassionate. Yes? David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Emily, I think I am sick, and I do need help to get better. Okay, Emily said with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to even the most complicated situations. So, you'll get help, and then you'll get better, and then we won't have money problems anymore? Claire and Margaret exchanged glances. The adult world of legal consequences, financial damage, and criminal investigations was far more complex than Emily's straightforward problem-solution framework could accommodate. But perhaps there was wisdom in the child's approach that the adults had been missing. It's not quite that simple, sweetheart, Claire said gently. Getting better from addiction takes time, and fixing the problems that addiction caused also takes time. There might be some changes in our family while we're working on getting better. What kind of changes? James asked, his attention now fully engaged. Margaret realized this conversation was heading toward territory that would require careful navigation. The children needed enough truth to understand their situation without being burdened with details that would frighten or overwhelm them. Well, Claire said, looking to Margaret and David for support, we might need to move to a smaller house for a while, and we might not be able to do some of the things we used to do, like going to restaurants or buying new toys very often. Emily considered this information with the seriousness of a judge reviewing evidence. Would we still be together? All of us? Yes, David said quickly, his voice stronger than it had been all evening. No matter what happens, we'll be together. That's the most important thing. And would we still get to visit Grandma Margaret? Margaret felt her heart constrict. Of course, darling. No matter what changes happen, you'll always be my grandchildren, and you'll always be welcome in my home. Emily nodded, apparently satisfied with these assurances. But her next question caught everyone off guard. "Grandma Margaret, are you mad at Mommy and Daddy?" The directness of the question forced Margaret to confront emotions she'd been struggling to understand. Was she mad? Disappointed? Hurt? All of those feelings were true, but in the presence of these children, she found herself focusing on what mattered most. "I'm sad about the choices that were made," Margaret said carefully. "And I'm disappointed that problems got so big before anyone asked for help. But Emily, being mad at someone and loving them can happen at the same time. I love your mommy and Daddy, and I love you and James. And that love doesn't change just because adults make mistakes." Emily seemed to absorb this concept with the same careful attention she gave to her favorite stories. "Like when I'm mad at James for breaking my toy, but I still love him?" Exactly like that. James, who had been quietly playing with Margaret's rings, looked up suddenly. "Grandma Margaret, will you still tell us stories about your pretty things?" The innocent question hit Margaret with unexpected force. James was referring to the antique collection, the Meissen figurines, the music box, the silver tea service, that had been photographed and catalogued for sale without her knowledge. These objects that had become evidence of betrayal were, to her grandchildren, simply the backdrop for stories about family history and the adventures she and Harold had shared. "Of course I will, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "Would you like to hear a story now?" Both children nodded eagerly, and Margaret realized that this might be exactly what they all needed, a return to the simple ritual of storytelling that had been a constant in their family relationships. Margaret rose and moved to the mantelpiece, where the Victorian music box sat among the Meissen figurines. She wound the delicate mechanism, and the familiar tinkling melody filled the room. Emily and James gathered close, their faces bright with anticipation. "Your grandfather won this music box for me at a county fair in 1963, Margaret began, slipping into the comfortable rhythm of a story told many times. "He was trying to impress me by knocking down milk bottles with a baseball, but he kept missing." As Margaret told the familiar story, she watched the faces around her. Emily and James listened with rapt attention, as they always did. Claire's expression had softened, the desperate tension of the past hours giving way to something that looked like hope. David sat quietly in Harold's chair, tears still wet on his cheeks, but his attention focused on his children's obvious comfort. With the ritual, when the story ended, Emily asked the question she always asked, "And you kept it all these years because it reminded you of Grandpa Harold?" "Yes, darling, because some things are worth keeping not because of how much money they're worth, but because of the love they represent." Emily nodded gravely, then looked around the room at the various antiques that had populated her grandmother's stories over the years. "Grandma Margaret, if you had to choose between keeping all your pretty things and helping Mommy and Daddy not be in trouble, what would you choose?" The question, delivered with a child's innocent directness, cut straight to the heart of everything Margaret had been struggling with. Emily's 8-year-old logic had identified the central choice that all the adult complexity had been dancing around. Margaret looked at her granddaughter, then at Claire and David, then back at the antiques that surrounded them. Each piece represented decades of careful collecting, precious memories with Harold, a lifetime of shared experiences. But sitting here with her family, broken, flawed, struggling, but still her family, she realized that Emily had asked exactly the right question. "Well," Margaret said slowly, "I think the most important things can't be bought or sold. The most important things are people and love and family staying together even when times are hard." Emily smiled with satisfaction, as if her grandmother had passed some kind of test. "So you'd choose to help us?" Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger and betrayal that had been consuming her since she'd discovered the deception. These children, innocent, resilient, wise in ways that adults had forgotten, were showing her what really mattered. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret said quietly. "I would choose to help you." The room fell silent except for the continued tinkling of the music box melody. Claire was crying again, but these were different tears, relief and gratitude rather than desperation and shame. David sat straighter in Harold's chair, as if his daughter's questions had given him permission to hope. "For redemption, does that mean we don't have to move?" James asked. Margaret looked at Claire and David, seeing the question reflected in their faces. The legal consequences were still real. The financial damage still existed. The addiction still needed treatment. But perhaps there were ways to address these problems that didn't require the complete destruction of the family unit. "It means," Margaret said carefully, "that we're going to work together to figure out the best way to help everyone. It might still mean some changes, but it also means that no one has to face these problems alone." Emily nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose logic had been validated. "Good, because families are supposed to help each other, right?" "Right," Margaret agreed, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. As the music box wound down and the melody faded, Margaret realized that her 8-year-old granddaughter had accomplished something that hours of adult conversation hadn't managed. Emily had cut through the complexity of legal consequences and financial calculations to identify what truly mattered: family, love, and the choice to help rather than condemn. The path forward was still uncertain, still complicated by legal realities and practical considerations. But for the first time since discovering the deception, Margaret felt clarity about her priorities. The antiques were beautiful, meaningful, connected to precious memories, but they were ultimately just things. The people in this room, flawed, struggling, human, were what actually mattered. Tomorrow, she would call Detective Chen. She would work with lawyers and prosecutors to find a resolution that balanced justice with mercy. She would help David find treatment for his addiction and support Claire as she faced the consequences of her desperate choices. But tonight, she would focus on what Emily's wisdom had revealed: that love given freely was never truly lost, and that sometimes the most important legacy wasn't what you kept, but what you chose to give away. Part 8. Margaret's Choice. The house felt different after the children left, their innocent wisdom lingering in the air like the fading notes of the music box melody. Margaret sat alone in her living room at midnight, surrounded by the antiques that had defined her identity for decades. David and Claire had gone home to begin the difficult conversation with Emily and James about the changes ahead, leaving Margaret to confront the choice that her granddaughter's simple question had crystallized. If you had to choose between keeping all your pretty things and helping Mommy and Daddy not be in trouble, what would you choose? Margaret rose from her chair and walked slowly through her house, seeing each piece with new eyes. The Georgian, silver tea service gleamed in the moonlight streaming through the dining room windows. The Meissen figurines stood sentinel on the mantelpiece, their painted faces serene and unchanging. The walnut armoire that had belonged to her grandmother dominated the bedroom, its carved details as intricate as the day it was made. Each piece told a story, held a memory, represented years of careful hunting through estate sales and antique shops with Harold by her side. But Emily's question had forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. She had been treating these objects as if they were more important than the living people who needed her help. Margaret returned to her office and opened her laptop. Detective Chen's business card lay beside the keyboard, a reminder that the legal consequences of this crisis would unfold with or without her cooperation. But Margaret had spent her life solving problems through research and careful planning. If she was going to sacrifice her collection to save her family, she would do it strategically, deliberately, and on her own terms. She opened a new document and began typing. Antique Collection Assessment. Priority for sale. The process took hours. Margaret moved through her house with a legal pad, cataloging every significant piece, researching current market values, and most importantly, assessing the emotional significance of each item. Some decisions were obvious. The music box Harold had won for her would never be sold. The spode china they'd used for their anniversary dinners each year belonged to family. History in ways that transcended monetary value, but other pieces, while valuable and beautiful, carried less personal weight. The mahogany dining table they'd bought as an investment, rather than from love. The collection of depression glass that had been more about completing a set than preserving memories. The Victorian parlor furniture that looked impressive but had never been used for actual family gatherings. By 3 a.m, Margaret had created 2 lists: keep and sell. The sell list was longer than she'd expected, containing pieces worth nearly $60,000 according to her research. Not enough to solve David's entire financial crisis, but sufficient to prevent the immediate threat of foreclosure and provide breathing room for longer-term solutions. But selling the pieces was only part of the equation. Margaret needed to ensure that David's addiction was addressed, that Claire faced appropriate consequences for her actions, and that the legal complications were resolved in a way that protected the children's stability. At dawn, Margaret called Robert Sterling. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Sterling's voice was alert despite the early hour. "I was expecting to hear from you. How can I help?" "Mr. Sterling, I need to sell some pieces from my collection. Legitimately this. Time, with proper documentation and fair pricing. But I need your help navigating some complicated circumstances." Margaret explained the situation with careful honesty, holding nothing back about the fraud, the addiction, or the legal investigation. Sterling listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said when she finished, "I appreciate your honesty about the family situation. It explains the inconsistencies in the email communications that concerned me. How can I help you resolve this properly? I need fair market. Appraisals for specific pieces I'm willing to sell. I need documentation that will satisfy both the insurance company and any legal proceedings. And I need the transactions to be transparent enough to demonstrate that this is my choice, not the result of coercion or fraud. I can certainly help with that. When would you like me to come for the appraisals?" "This morning, if possible." Time is a factor in several ways. Sterling arrived at 10 o'clock with a colleague, both carrying the professional equipment necessary for formal appraisals. Margaret had prepared for their visit by arranging the sell items in the dining room, each piece tagged with her research notes and emotional assessment. "You've done excellent preliminary work," Sterling observed, examining Margaret's documentation. "Your valuations are quite accurate. May I ask about your decision-making process? Some of these pieces are exceptionally fine." Margaret touched the Georgian silver tea service, one of the items marked for sale. "This set is beautiful and valuable, but Harold and I only used it twice in 40 years. It's been more about having a fine tea service than about the memories we made with it. The spode china we used every Sunday. That stays. The silver that sat in a cabinet looking impressive, that can help my family start over." Sterling nodded, with understanding. "You're distinguishing between possessions and memories. It's a wise approach, though not everyone has the emotional clarity to make those distinctions under pressure." The formal appraisal process took most of the day. Each piece was photographed, measured, researched, and documented according to professional standards. Sterling's colleague handled the technical aspects while Sterling himself worked with Margaret to ensure that her intentions were clearly recorded. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sterling said as they completed the paperwork, "I want to be certain you understand that these sales, once completed, are final. Are you comfortable with these decisions?" Margaret looked around her dining room, now containing only the pieces she'd chosen to keep. The room felt different, less impressive perhaps, but somehow more intimate. The remaining pieces were the ones that had been part of daily life, family celebrations, quiet moments with Harold. "I'm comfortable with these decisions," she said firmly. But I need these sales to happen quickly, and I need the proceeds to be clearly designated for specific purposes. What kind of purposes? Margaret had spent the morning thinking about conditions and structure. Simply giving David money to pay off gambling debts would solve the immediate crisis, but wouldn't address the underlying addiction or prevent future problems. The proceeds will be held in trust, managed by you as a neutral party. Funds will be released only for specific purposes, paying the mortgage arrears to prevent foreclosure, covering legal fees for both the criminal resolution and addiction, treatment, and funding a structured rehabilitation program for my son. Any remaining funds will be held for the children's education, managed independently of their parents' access. Sterling made notes as Margaret outlined her conditions. This sounds like you're establishing a family trust with specific restrictions. I can recommend attorneys who specialize in this kind of arrangement. Good. I also need the trust to include provisions for ongoing accountability. David's access to any funds is contingent on his participation in treatment and financial counseling. Claire's situation needs to be resolved legally, but I want any sentencing recommendations to focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Mrs. Whitmore, may I ask why you're structuring it this way rather than simply helping your family directly? Margaret considered the question carefully. Because love without accountability isn't really love, it's enabling. David's addiction thrived in an environment where he could avoid consequences. Claire's desperate choices were made in isolation, without support or guidance. I want to help them, but I also want to ensure that my help actually helps, rather than just postponing the next crisis. As Sterling and his colleague packed their equipment, Margaret felt a profound sense of resolution settling over her. The house looked different now, less crowded but somehow more peaceful. The remaining pieces seemed to breathe with renewed significance, no longer competing for attention with items that had been beautiful but not beloved. That evening, Margaret called Detective Chen. "Detective, this is Margaret Whitmore. I'm ready to discuss how we can resolve this situation." "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm glad to hear from you. Have you made a decision about cooperating with the prosecution?" "I've made several decisions. First, I'm willing to cooperate fully with the investigation, but I want to advocate strongly for a resolution that focuses on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Second, I'm taking steps to address the underlying financial crisis that motivated the fraud. Third, I want to ensure that any legal proceedings consider the best interests of my grandchildren." Detective Chen was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you tell me more about the steps you're taking to address the financial crisis?" Margaret explained her decision to sell parts of her collection and establish the structured trust. She described the conditions she was placing on the funds, and her requirements for David's treatment and Claire's accountability. "This is unusual," Detective Chen said finally. "Most victims in elder fraud cases want maximum prosecution of the perpetrators. You're essentially creating a comprehensive family intervention while cooperating with law enforcement." "Detective, I've learned that being a victim and being helpless aren't the same thing. I was victimized by the fraud, but I refuse to be helpless in response to it. I'm choosing to take control of this situation in a way that serves justice while also serving my family's long-term well-being." "I respect that approach, Mrs. Whitmore. Let me discuss this with the prosecutor's office. Your cooperation and the restitution measures you're implementing will carry significant weight in determining how we proceed." After the call ended, Margaret sat in Harold's old chair, surrounded by the antiques she'd chosen to keep. The music box sat on the side table, its delicate mechanism catching the lamplight. The Spode china was visible through the glass doors of the dining room cabinet. The mice and figurines stood on the mantelpiece, their painted faces serene. These were the pieces that would remain, the objects that carried not just beauty, but memory, not just value, but meaning. They represented the core of what she and Harold had built together, not the impressive collection that others admired, but the intimate objects that had been part of their daily lives. Margaret's phone rang. David's number appeared on the screen. "Mom?" His voice was tentative, uncertain. "Claire told me you spent the day with appraisers. Are you really going to sell parts of your collection to help us?" "Yes, David, but there are conditions." Margaret outlined the trust structure, the requirements for treatment, the accountability measures. David listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or gratitude. "Mom, I don't know how to thank you. After everything I've done, everything Claire did, you're still willing to help us. David, I'm not doing this because you deserve it. I'm doing it because Emily and James deserve stability, and because I believe you and Claire can become the people they need you to be. But this help comes with the expectation that you'll do the hard work of recovery." "I will, Mom. I promise. I'll do whatever it takes." Margaret heard the sincerity in her son's voice, but she'd heard promises before. The trust structure would ensure that good intentions were backed by concrete actions. The treatment program starts Monday. The financial counseling begins the following week. The legal proceedings will move forward, but with recommendations for rehabilitation rather than incarceration. This is your chance to rebuild your life properly, David. Don't waste it. After the call ended, Margaret walked through her house one more time, saying goodbye to the pieces that would soon belong to others. The Georgian silver would grace someone else's table. The mahogany furniture would anchor a different dining room. The Depression glass would catch sunlight in unfamiliar windows. But they would serve their final purpose in her care, not as objects to be admired, but as tools of redemption, instruments of healing, bridges between the family they had been and the family they might become. Margaret touched the music box, gently, winding its delicate mechanism. As the familiar melody began to play, she thought of Harold, of the stories she would continue to tell Emily and James, of the legacy that truly mattered. Some things were worth keeping because of their beauty. Some things were worth keeping because of their history. But the most precious things were worth giving away, because love shared was love multiplied, and the truest wealth was measured not in possessions accumulated, but in lives transformed. The music box played its sweet melody as Margaret made her final preparations for the journey ahead. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and paperwork, treatment programs, and court proceedings, the complex machinery of family rehabilitation and legal resolution. But tonight, surrounded by the treasures she'd chosen to keep and strengthened by the sacrifice she'd chosen to make, Margaret felt the profound peace that came from knowing she'd chosen love over possession, hope over bitterness, family over pride. The music box played its sweet melody as Margaret made her final preparations for the journey ahead. Harold would have been proud, she thought, as she closed the lid gently and prepared for sleep. 3 months later, Margaret pulled into the driveway of David and Claire's new home, a modest 2-bedroom cottage on Maple Street, far smaller than their previous house, but somehow more welcoming. The tiny front yard showed signs of Claire's gardening efforts, marigolds in neat rows, a small vegetable patch where Emily was learning to grow tomatoes, and a sandbox where James spent hours constructing elaborate castles. Margaret carried a carefully wrapped package as she walked to the front door, which opened before she could knock. Emily appeared, her face bright with the unguarded joy that had returned over the past few months. "Grandma Margaret, you came!" Emily wrapped her arms around Margaret's waist, a gesture that had become even more precious since the family's crisis. "I have so much to tell you." "And I have something special to show you," Margaret replied, holding up the wrapped package. "But first, let me see how you and James are settling in." The interior of the cottage was a study in creative adaptation. Claire had arranged their remaining furniture to maximize the limited space, creating cozy conversation areas and ensuring that each family member had their own special corner. Emily's books filled a small shelf near the window where she could read in natural light. James's toys were organized in colorful bins that doubled as seating. David's desk occupied an alcove that served as his home office, where he worked on the freelance projects that had become his new career path. "It's smaller than our old house," Emily said with the matter-of-fact acceptance that had become her trademark. "But it's easier to keep clean, and we're all closer together. I like that James's room is right next to mine now." Margaret marveled at her granddaughter's resilience. The past 3 months had brought enormous changes to Emily's life. A new home, her father's admission to treatment, her mother's return to work, and the complicated emotions that came with understanding that adults sometimes failed and needed help. But Emily had navigated these changes with remarkable grace, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining her essential optimism. Claire emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. The past 3 months had changed her as well. The desperate, haunted expression that had marked her face during the crisis had been replaced by something steadier. Not quite peace, but a kind of determined hope. Her work schedule allowed her to be home when the children returned from school, and she'd developed new skills in budget management and meal planning that had given her a sense of control over their reduced circumstances. "Margaret, thank you for coming," Claire said, embracing her mother-in-law with genuine warmth. "David should be home any minute. He had his 3-month counseling session today." The mention of David's treatment brought a familiar tightness to Margaret's chest. The past 3 months had been a testament to the slow, difficult work of addiction recovery. David had attended every counseling session, participated in group therapy, and submitted to the financial oversight that was part of his probation agreement. But Margaret had learned that recovery wasn't a straight line. There had been difficult days, moments of backsliding, and times when David's shame threatened to overwhelm his progress. "How has he been?" Margaret asked quietly. "Better," Claire replied, and Margaret heard the cautious optimism in her voice. "Really better. The counseling is helping him understand not just the gambling, but the underlying issues that made him vulnerable to it. He's learning to communicate instead of hiding problems." As if summoned by their conversation, David's car pulled into the driveway. Margaret watched through the window as her son emerged from his vehicle, his movements carrying a different energy than she'd seen in years. Gone was the furtive, nervous behavior that had marked his interactions during the crisis. He walked, with purpose, his shoulders straight, his expression open. "Mom," David said as he entered the house, embracing Margaret with genuine affection. "I'm glad you're here. I have news." Margaret studied her son's face, reading the mixture of pride and vulnerability in his expression. The past 3 months had aged him in some ways. The easy charm that had masked his problems had been replaced by a more mature, grounded demeanor. But there was also something younger about him, as if the weight of deception had been lifted from his shoulders. "Good news, I hope," Margaret said. 3 months clean," David announced, his voice carrying quiet pride. "No gambling, no online betting, no casino visits. Dr. Martinez says I'm making excellent progress with the underlying anxiety issues that triggered the gambling behavior." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She'd been afraid to hope for this kind of success, knowing how difficult addiction recovery could be. But David's transformation seemed genuine. Not the surface charm he'd used to mask problems, but a deeper change in how he approached life's challenges. "I'm proud of you," Margaret said simply, and watched her son's face light up with a joy she hadn't seen since his childhood. "Dad, tell Grandma Margaret about your new job," Emily called from the living room, where she was arranging her homework on the coffee table. David smiled, his expression carrying a mix of pride and humility. "I've been offered a full-time position with the consulting firm where I've been doing freelance work. It's not as much money as my old job, but it's steady, and the work environment is much healthier. Less pressure, more collaborative." Margaret nodded, remembering how David's high-stress corporate job had contributed to his gambling escalation. The new position, while less prestigious, seemed better suited to his recovery. That's wonderful news, Margaret said. And how are you feeling about the change? Honestly? Relieved, David replied. The old job was killing me. The constant pressure, the competitive atmosphere, the expectation that I could solve everything through sheer force of will. This new position lets me use my skills without the toxic environment that made me want to escape through gambling. As they talked, Margaret observed the family dynamics that had evolved over the past 3 months. David and Claire communicated with a directness that hadn't existed before the crisis. Emily and James interacted with their parents with the easy affection of children who felt secure in their family's stability. The cottage felt like a home in ways that their previous house, despite its impressive size, had not. Grandma Margaret, Emily said, approaching with her homework folder. Will you help me with my history project? I'm supposed to write about family traditions, and I want to include the stories you tell about your antiques. Margaret smiled, remembering the wrapped package she'd brought. Actually, that's perfect timing. I brought something special to show you. Margaret unwrapped the package to reveal a leather-bound journal and a small wooden box. This journal belonged to your great-great-grandmother, my grandmother. She wrote down stories about the family history and the objects that were important to her. I thought it was time to start a new tradition. Emily's eyes widened as Margaret opened the journal to reveal pages of careful handwriting. She wrote about the antiques? She wrote about everything, the stories behind objects, the memories they held, the reasons they mattered to the family. I've been thinking that we should do the same thing, but in a way that includes all of you. Margaret opened the wooden box to reveal a small digital recorder. I want to record the stories behind the antiques I've kept, but I also want to record new stories about this time in our family's life, about how we overcame challenges together, about what we learned and how we grew. Claire looked up from where she'd been helping James with his coloring book. You want to document the crisis? I want to document the recovery, Margaret corrected. Emily's history project asks about family traditions. I think one of our family's most important traditions should be honesty about both our successes and our failures, and the stories of how we help each other through difficult times. David sat down beside Emily, his expression thoughtful. You want to include what happened to me? The gambling, the fraud, all of it? I want to include how we faced it together, Margaret replied. How your addiction nearly destroyed the family, but how we chose to heal instead of to blame. How Claire made terrible choices from love, and how she's working to make amends. How Emily and James showed us that children are stronger and wiser than we sometimes give them credit for. Emily nodded eagerly, like how James wasn't scared when we moved to the smaller house, and how I learned that families can still be happy even when they have problems. Exactly like that, Margaret agreed. These are the stories that matter, not just the pretty objects and their histories, but the human stories of how we take care of each other. Over the next hour, Margaret began the process of documenting their family's recent history. She recorded David talking about his recovery process, his voice steady as he described the daily work of maintaining sobriety. She captured Claire's insights about rebuilding trust and learning to ask for help instead of handling crises alone. She preserved Emily's observations about how families could be strong even when they faced big problems. James, initially shy about the recording device, eventually warmed up enough to share his thoughts about their new house and his excitement about the vegetable garden he was planning with his mother. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret realized that this process was creating something more valuable than simple documentation. The act of recording their stories was helping the family process their experiences, acknowledge their growth, and consciously choose the lessons they wanted to remember. Grandma Margaret, Emily said as Margaret prepared to leave, will you teach me how to take care of the antiques? I mean, the real way, not just looking at them, but actually caring for them. Margaret felt her heart swell with pride. I would love to teach you that. In fact, I've been thinking about giving you something special to practice with. From her purse, Margaret withdrew a small silver locket, one of the pieces she'd chosen to keep from her collection. This belonged to my mother. It's not the most valuable piece I own, but it's one of the most meaningful. I want you to have it, and I want to teach you how to care for it properly. Emily accepted the locket with the reverence of someone who understood that she was receiving more than just jewelry. Will you tell me the story that goes with it? Of course. But first, let me show you how to clean silver properly, and how to store it so it doesn't tarnish. Caring for antiques is about more than just ownership. It's about stewardship, about preserving things for the people who come after us. As Margaret demonstrated the proper care techniques, she realized that she was passing on more than just knowledge about antiques. She was teaching Emily about responsibility, about the value of preservation, about the importance of caring for things that connected them to their family history. The afternoon concluded with a family dinner around the small table in the cottage's kitchen. The meal was simple: spaghetti with homemade sauce, salad from Claire's garden, bread that Emily had helped bake. But the conversation was rich with laughter, honest communication, and the comfortable intimacy of a family that had learned to be authentic with each other. "This is nice," James observed, his 5-year-old wisdom cutting through adult complexity. "I like it when we all eat together and nobody looks sad." Margaret glanced around the table at her family. David, 3 months sober and genuinely committed to his recovery. Claire, working part-time and rebuilding her sense of self-worth. Emily, adapting to change with remarkable resilience. James, thriving in an environment of increased stability and honesty. The cottage was smaller than their previous home. Their financial resources were more limited, and their future still required careful management. But there was something in this modest kitchen that had been missing from their more impressive previous circumstances: a sense of genuine peace, of problems faced rather than hidden, of love expressed through action rather than just words. As Margaret drove home that evening, she reflected on the changes that 3 months had brought. The legal proceedings had been resolved with probation and community service rather than incarceration, thanks to the family's commitment to rehabilitation, and Margaret's advocacy for restorative rather than punitive justice. David's treatment was ongoing, but showing measurable progress. Claire had found meaningful work that allowed her to contribute to the family's financial stability while maintaining her role as primary caregiver for the children. Most importantly, the family had developed new patterns of communication and support that seemed sustainable rather than crisis-driven. They had learned to face problems together instead of allowing shame and pride to isolate them from each other. Margaret's house, while quieter without some of the antiques she'd sold, felt more peaceful. The remaining pieces seemed to breathe, with renewed significance, no longer competing for attention, but serving as focal points for family stories and connections. The trust fund she'd established was serving its purpose, providing stability while maintaining accountability. But perhaps the most significant change was the new tradition they'd begun: the conscious documentation of their family's journey through crisis and recovery. The stories they were recording would become part of their legacy, honest accounts of human fallibility and the power of love to heal even deep wounds. As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she thought about the journal her grandmother had kept, the stories that had been passed down through generations of her family. Tomorrow, she would continue the work of recording their contemporary story, not a fairy tale with easy endings, but a real human narrative of struggle, growth, and the daily choice to love each other through imperfection. The family they were becoming was different from the family they had been. Smaller in some ways, more modest in their circumstances, but somehow larger in their capacity for honesty, support, and genuine intimacy. The crisis had stripped away pretense and revealed what truly mattered. Not the impression they made on others, but the care they showed each other. Not the possessions they accumulated, but the memories they created together. 3 months had transformed victims into survivors, shame into growth, and a family crisis into a foundation for deeper connection. The work was far from over. Recovery was a daily commitment. Trust required constant nurturing, and the children's needs would continue to evolve. But they had proven to themselves that they could face difficulties together, that love could be stronger than addiction, and that sometimes the most profound healing came not from avoiding pain, but from walking through it hand in hand. Margaret fell asleep that night with a profound sense of gratitude, not for the comfortable resolution of all problems, but for the opportunity to discover what her family was truly capable of when they chose courage over comfort, honesty over pretense, and love over fear. Part 10. Legacy Redefined. 1 year after the crisis, M. But he kept missing, and I kept telling him we should just enjoy the fair and not worry about winning prizes. As Margaret told the familiar story, she marveled at how much had changed since that terrible evening when she'd first confronted Claire about the fraudulent emails. The collection room, while smaller now, felt more intimate. Each remaining piece had earned its place not just through beauty or value, but through the depth of memory it carried. The mice and figurines still graced the mantelpiece, their painted faces serene. The spode china remained in its place of honor in the cabinet. The silver locket that had belonged to her mother now hung around Emily's neck, polished to a gentle gleam by her granddaughter's careful attention. And he finally won it on the very last try, Emily finished along with Margaret, her voice carrying satisfaction at the story's happy ending. That's right. And you know what he said when he handed it to me? He said, "Margaret, some things are worth working for, even when they seem impossible," Emily recited with perfect accuracy. Margaret felt her heart swell with love for this bright child who had absorbed not just the stories, but their deeper meanings. Over the past year, Emily had become the keeper of family narratives, the bridge between generations, the living proof that legacy was about more than objects. "Grandma Margaret," Emily said, carefully placing the music box back on its designated spot, "are you going to write down all the stories today?" Margaret nodded, gesturing toward the leather journal and laptop that sat ready on the small writing desk Harold had made for her 40th birthday. "That's exactly what I'm going to do. Would you like to help me?" For the past month, Margaret had been working on a comprehensive documentation project, recording not just the stories behind her remaining antiques, but the larger narrative of their family's journey through crisis and recovery. The leather journal her grandmother had kept had inspired this new tradition, but Margaret's version would be more complete, including photographs, recorded conversations, and detailed accounts of how objects connected to family history. Emily nodded eagerly and settled beside Margaret at the desk. "Should we start with the music box story I just heard?" "Actually," Margaret said, opening her laptop to a document she'd been working on, "I want to start with something different. I want to write about what we learned this year, about what really matters when everything else falls away." Margaret began typing, her words flowing with the clarity that had come from 12 months of reflection. The Whitmore Family Legacy, a True Accounting. 1 year ago, I believed that my antique collection represented the most important legacy I could leave my family. Each piece had been carefully chosen, lovingly maintained, and thoroughly documented. I thought I was preserving history, maintaining beauty, creating something valuable to pass to future generations. I was right about creating something valuable to pass on, but wrong about what that something was. Emily read over Margaret's shoulder, her reading skills having advanced remarkably over the past year. "Are you writing about when Daddy was sick with gambling and Mommy made the bad choices?" "I'm writing about how we helped each other get better," Margaret corrected gently, "about how families can be stronger after they go through hard times together." The front door opened, and David's voice called through the house. "Mom, Emily, we're here." Margaret and Emily made their way to the living room, where David stood with Claire and James, all of them carrying covered dishes and wearing the relaxed expressions of people comfortable in their own skin. The past year had been kind to all of them. David's recovery had continued steadily. Claire had thrived in her return to work, and the children had adapted to their new circumstances with remarkable resilience. 1 year, David announced, his voice carrying quiet pride. 12 months without gambling. Dr. Martinez says I'm ready to transition from weekly to monthly counseling sessions. Margaret embraced her son, feeling the solid strength of someone who had done the difficult work of recovery. I'm proud of you, not just for staying clean, but for the man you've become through this process. Claire began arranging their contributions to what had become a monthly family dinner tradition. The meals were simple affairs, but they carried weight as celebrations of progress, acknowledgments of growth, and investments in continued connection. Mom, Claire said as she worked, I have some news too. The marketing firm offered me a promotion to senior account manager. It's full-time, but with flexible hours so I can still be present for the children. Margaret felt a surge of pride for her daughter-in-law, who had transformed from a desperate woman making terrible choices into someone confidently rebuilding her professional identity while maintaining her commitment to family. As they shared dinner around Margaret's dining room table, using the spode china that had survived every crisis and celebration of the past 60 years, Margaret reflected on the changes that 1 year had brought. The legal consequences had been fully resolved, with Claire completing her community service and David maintaining his probation requirements. The financial crisis had stabilized through careful budgeting and the strategic use of the trust Margaret had established. But more importantly, the family had developed new patterns of communication, support, and shared responsibility that seemed genuinely sustainable. Grandma Margaret, James said, his 6-year-old voice serious with purpose, when I'm bigger, will you teach me about taking care of old things too? Margaret smiled at her youngest grandchild, seeing in him the same curiosity and care that Emily had shown. Of course, sweetheart, but remember the most important old things to take care of are the people we love. After dinner, as the family gathered in the living room, Margaret returned to her documentation project. But instead of working alone, she found herself surrounded by all of them. David sharing memories of objects from his childhood, Claire contributing insights about the lessons they'd learned together, Emily and James asking questions that revealed their growing understanding of family history. You know what I realized today? Margaret said as she saved her work and closed the laptop. The antiques I sold weren't really lost. They served their most important purpose. They helped save our family. And the ones I kept aren't valuable because of their age or rarity. They're valuable because they give us reasons to tell stories to each other. Emily nodded with the wisdom that continued to surprise the adults. Like how the music box isn't just pretty, but it reminds us that Grandpa Harold never gave up on things that mattered. Exactly like that. As the evening wound down and David's family prepared to leave, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of ending, but the completion of beginning. The sense that they had successfully transformed crisis into opportunity, loss into growth, betrayal into deeper trust. Same time next month? Claire asked as they gathered their belongings. Same time next month, Margaret confirmed, embracing each of them in turn. After they left, Margaret returned to her collection room and opened her laptop once more. She had stories to record, memories to preserve, and a legacy to document. But this legacy would be different from the one she'd once imagined. Not a catalog of valuable objects, but a record of human resilience, family love, and the daily choice to care for each other through imperfection. Margaret began typing the conclusion to her family's story. The true legacy we leave isn't found in the objects we accumulate, but in the love we share, the stories we tell, and the strength we give each other to face whatever comes next. My antique collection will eventually belong to museums or other collectors, but the family we've built together, honest, supportive, resilient, will endure for generations. Some things are worth keeping. Some things are worth giving away. But the most valuable things, love, forgiveness, hope, grow stronger when shared. This is the legacy I choose to leave. Not perfect people, but people who choose to love each other through imperfection. Not a family without problems, but a family that faces problems together. Not objects that maintain their value, but relationships that increase in worth with every story shared, every meal enjoyed, every crisis weathered hand in hand. Margaret saved the document and closed her laptop. Tomorrow, she would continue the work of documenting their family's stories. But tonight, she would simply enjoy the peace of knowing that the most important work, the work of love, was never finished, but always beginning again. Outside her window, Harold's roses bloomed in their second year without his care, tended now by Emily during her weekend visits. The flowers were as beautiful as ever, proof that some things survived not because they were preserved unchanged, but because they were loved enough to be nurtured through every season. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.